So my candidacy, when I talk about eco-populism, is recognizing we need to challenge power and wealth. There are very few small people, group of people, who are holding far too much power, far too much wealth, and power, just like wealth, should be redistributed. We don't win the conversation about migration by giving an inch to the right. And Keir Starmer, if you're being generous, has given an inch to the right. I'd say he's given a lot more than an inch. I would never ape Nigel Farage in terms of the things he stands for or the lies he tells. But in the way that he tells a story, I think we need to tell similar stories, but our stories are based in fact, our stories are based in science, his stories are based in lies and misinformation.
So I'm here with the Green Party deputy leader, who was standing to be the leader of the party. And it was around 2 weeks ago, or no, 10 days ago, you announced your bid to become leader. I actually think it's good that we're doing this interview now rather than straight away, because quite a lot has happened, right? Now, despite the party making gains in the local elections, it was pretty good. Clearly, you think the party isn't heading in the right direction, otherwise you wouldn't be standing. So what does your candidacy represent?
So I'm talking about bold leadership now, and I can break that down for you. So bold, saying exactly what needs to be said, really standing for things unequivocally, and also just as importantly, being really clear about what we stand against. When I talk about leadership, it's both my leadership, but just as importantly, the leadership all around the country. I'm talking about grassroots communities, where I'm really excited when I think about who are the future MPs that I've not even met yet, because of the people as I've been traveling the country who are running a food bank or attending the local mosque or at the local school gate, just speaking to people who go, oh, I didn't know the Green Party stood for that. Everyone knows we care about the environment and that's never going away. But it's linking the environmental issues with people's day-to-day issues, like cost of living issues, food on the table, heat in the homes, how you get to work, whether you're treated with dignity at work and a fair wage. And then when I say now, this is about not waiting until the general election. It's not even waiting until the leadership election in August, but actually right now, this week. What happens when lots of people join the Green Party? What happens when lots of people get excited about a real alternative to Labour, who will call them out on their winter fuel payments, on the two-child benefit cap, on the genocide in Gaza, calling out reform when 95% of their donations from oil and gas companies, from climate-denying companies, £2.3 million. These political parties have failed. There is a vacuum in British politics, and under my leadership, the Green Party will take that vacuum and lead a movement to Parliament.
Are you going to be putting class issues front and centre of the campaign?
Absolutely. I think it's both class issues, and I think it's recognizing that sometimes I think the media try and divide the working class from what often gets called the precariat. Those are people in precarious jobs. They're running independent businesses, or they're people who just each month are just trying to get by and pay the rent. I think when you bring those groups of people together, we're really talking about the 99% versus the 1%. So my candidacy, when I talk about eco-populism, is recognizing we need to challenge power and wealth. There are very few small people, group of people, who are holding far too much power, far too much wealth, and power, just like wealth, should be redistributed.
I want to talk about policy, actually, because sometimes we do a lot of these interviews, we don't actually get down to the policy. I want to ask you, what are the fundamental issues we as a society face, and what big policies do we need that can transform society?
So let's pick up where we just left off, the inequality in society. For decades, poor people have been getting poorer and rich people have been getting richer. So a central Green Party policy is a wealth tax. Now people often go, but what if people leave? Well, I talk about a group called the Patriotic Millionaires who I met recently. A group of millionaires who are saying, actually tax us more, because when you tax us, that's more money. It's not the only way, but it's one way of reducing inequality and putting more money into our public services, making sure people can get a GP appointment, making sure people can get a bus or a train that actually runs on time, is affordable and feels comfortable. It's about making sure that people, when they're in the education system, don't have a school that is crumbling. So funding public services is clearly one of the things through wealth taxation, but also looking at other measures too. I heard Gary Stevenson, who I met recently, say something which I think was so important for anyone on the left. He said, it is our job to define the principles, and then it's our job to make suggestions about how that could be done. You then, when you're in government or you have more MPs, you have a whole civil service who can iron out these details and make sure they exactly work. But what the right-wing media often do is take your principle, demand a fully fleshed policy without the mechanism of state, and then look to pick holes in, your numbers aren't absolutely perfect, or the system isn't absolutely perfect, and they use that as a way to attack the principles. Now, that's not me dodging the question. I'll give you some rough ideas, but I think it's always important to say, what are the principles? And actually, I've had a ringside seat for this in London because the London mayor has brought about free school meals. I've got lots of criticisms of Sadiq Khan that I can get onto, but this I wouldn't criticize for a second. I think it's a transformational policy that I'm so pleased that he's done. Now, the Tories have started to attack it, and they've attacked it on basis of universality. They're saying, why should rich kids get a free school meal? And the principle is very simple, that if you're a kid in school, there shouldn't be two queues between the children who can't afford lunch and the children who can afford an expensive lunch. You remove stigma by saying, actually, everyone can have this free lunch. And what we'll do instead is in taxation, we will charge wealthier people more in taxation, and that money will go back into things like free school meals. So it's about making sure that we're distributing those things fairly. When it comes to universal basic income, it's the exact same principle. It's about making sure that no one in this country should be living without a roof above their head, without a meal to go by, or without, not being able to afford to get the bus to work. It's about making sure everyone has a basic living standard. And if we think about why that's important, there are 2.3 million people using food banks. There are over 300,000 people who are homeless. There are over 3 million people living in fuel poverty. These are statistics, and just on their own, they can get lost, especially when you reel them off. But that tells a story. That tells a story of a completely broken society, an unequal society where we have politicians with vested interests, both from the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, and obviously Reform, who are doing what the vested interests are telling them to do. They've been bought and sold by those same people, and they're implementing policies that are not for working class communities. They are for corporate capital. And I think the only way we're really going to challenge that is by equalizing and making sure that everyone has a basic standard of living. For me, a universal basic income and or universal basic services, you can get into the complexities and nuances of that, is one of the single most ways you can transform our society. Are there problems with it? Absolutely. The far right, maybe not even far right, but Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, I think, all in the past, have shown interest in the universal basic income. So I don't think it's a perfect policy under a right-wing government.
And there's something concerning about that, though. It's that the way UBI could be weaponized is to make sure that wages are low because the state can prop it up. And this is why when I talk to people about universal basic income, it's very good that you want to have a floor for people. But my worry is that UBI will be abused by the state and by corporations. Why is essentially the state giving people a wage only for that to sort of subsidize corporate profits? And that's why I'm really interested in universal basic services. We have one, the NHS, free at point of use. 2019, the Labour Party offered free broadband. That was called broadband communism. But then COVID happened and people were like, oh, maybe this is a good idea. So I'm with you on UBI, but what can we talk about UBS? Okay. Maybe it might not be in the policy platform, but I want to delve into that.
No, I'm really interested in it. So I think there's two things. So I want to respond to the first point first. Whether it's artificial intelligence or actually the European Union, there are right-wing arguments for these things that I absolutely do not agree with and would challenge. However, that doesn't stop them being good things. And so, like, if we look at Europe, I still cannot see a better version for our country with more prosperity or well-being or freedom of movement than actually being in the European Union. Do I think the European Union is perfect? Absolutely not. In fact, it's highly problematic, especially when you have lots of right-wing governments who are moving it towards a neoliberal path. But I don't think the answer to that is to be out of it. I think the answer to that is to get in there and make sure that we support our allies and people who share our politics across the world and help them get elected or support them getting elected. I want to see a socialist European Union one day. Another Europe is possible. Artificial intelligence, same thing. I've got lots of issues with artificial intelligence. If it's going to remove people's jobs, if it's, in healthcare, Wes Streeting's clear plan to privatize the NHS is to have robots treat people. When people are ill, the last thing you want is something that is not human. The last thing you want is something that literally by its very design can't care for you. So I'm deeply concerned about artificial intelligence. At the same time, can I see ways that, if harnessed, could give people more freedom in their life, more time to spend with friends and loved ones, not doing tasks that they don't enjoy that can actually be done by a computer? Sure, I'm not against that, but let's make sure that's harnessed properly. So that's the first bit. To come to universal basic services. I'm enthusiastic about it, but the reason why I prefer a universal basic income is about freedom and independence. Sometimes one of the arguments against universal basic income is that, people just spend it on alcohol or drugs. And first of all, you did an interview with Zoe Garbett, people should watch. I think her answer would be, like, let's make sure people are supported if they have problematic drug habits or alcohol habits. Let's make sure that they are given that space. But actually, if people make a consensual choice and that's the thing they're choosing to do, why do people get to choose what people spend their money on? And actually, wouldn't we be better in a legalized, regulated drug system where we could have sensible conversations about these things? If I don't go as far as drugs and alcohol, what if people want to spend their money not on creating economic growth by Keir Starmer, but actually want to create art or music or indeed left-wing podcasts or engage in politics and activism? What if a universal basic income gave people more space to do that? So it's both a job and you can make money for it. but actually that's not the driving force. You could do it for the love of it or because it feels important to you. All of those things feel important to me. If it's a choice between a basic income and basic services, I don't like the fact the state get to say, we will only spend this big block of money, and it will be a big block of money on services. And actually, those things you want or love are not as important. I think it's really important that actually we say, let's make sure people have money to spend on the things that they want, the choice that they want, and let's make sure we fund public services. Um, the implication in your question, just to push back to make it clear, National Health Service should absolutely remain free at the point of
Yeah.
use, and I think that's non-negotiable. I think there's other things, I'd love, for instance, free public transport. That's something, under a green government, I'd love to see one day. But is it the first priority? No, I would go to universal basic income first so people could choose where they spend their money.
Would you then include housing in that? Because I see what you're saying, UBI, because I do hate those arguments where they say, oh, you give people money to spend on this and that. Who cares? It is their freedom. And I like you're making the freedom argument. But in terms of housing, that's not really a choice. People just need housing. And there's an argument within universal basic services is that essentially, at least renting off the state, there's free housing for all. Surely that would be better than just giving people more money, especially when we have a housing crisis and the costs are going up. And you might have a situation where the government's playing catch up by giving people more payments to pay for a bloated housing market, whereas we can make that free.
Absolutely. We have a housing crisis. And I think the real answer to this is to build council housing and rapidly. The conversation often gets into a NIMBY versus developers conversation. But actually, I think the thing people always need to know is that there are more developers sitting on land that has planning permission that they are not building on than the actual amount of homes that we need. There's 1.2 million households on the waiting list, but there are more spaces or landlords sitting on spaces waiting to build than they're actually building. And why are they doing that? Because they are not interested in building houses. They're interested in land banking because that's then an asset that they can sell off. If they do build, it'll be an empty building that is unaffordable that no one is going to live in. So actually, I don't think it's a landlord versus NIMBY argument. I think it's the people and people who need council houses versus property developers and political parties who are receiving donations from those same property developers. I think this is one of the key things that really needs to be called out because it's a narrative you just don't often hear. To come to your point though, housing is a public good. It should be a public good. And absolutely, that's certainly one way to do it is to do a mass house building program, particularly on brownfield sites. In London, there are enough brownfield sites that TfL own that if you put them all together, Transport for London, you would have a constituency the size of Camden. So the idea that there's no space left or we can't do this is a complete nonsense argument that's been propagated or pushed by these same property developers and the media have taken very happily into their hands.
You did mention Labour, and of course we're going to talk about the Labour Party. Let's be honest, the Labour Party have completely given up on the working class. It's undermined unions. We've seen how they've acted towards people standing on picket lines. What would you like to see to strengthen unions? And would you like to see the Greens have a big relationship with the unions? What efforts do you think the party need to make to get unions to affiliate with the Green Party en masse?
So I gave a speech last night at SOAS, and just after me, John McDonnell gave a speech. And unsurprisingly, I'd say our speech is very much intersected in the things we were talking about. But John's speech was very, very sad. He stood on stage and said, the speech is online, so I'm not looking to put words into his mouth, but he said he's been an MP for decades and he doesn't think he's had a worse week as an MP, both with the Keir Starmer comments echoing Enoch Powell, the genocide in Gaza, the cuts to winter fuel payments, just a sense that things aren't going to change. And the way he seemed so distraught and so sad, I really felt like at the end of the sentence, he was going to say something like, and that's why I'm joining the Green Party. I thought, I'm in the room. This is quite a moment for the media to have. But instead, the sentence he came out with was, and this is why we need to stay in the Labour Party to fight for the Labour Party. And
why is he wrong? And why is the remaining very few remaining left-wing MPs who are staying on in the Labour Party? Why should they stay and fight when clearly Keir Starmer doesn't care about these people?
Totally. So I want to caveat everything I say because I'm about to go at them with I have huge respect for John McDonnell. I think his politics are sound, and I can understand when you've been in a party for decades and it feels like your identity, why it is so hard to let go, but it is time to let go. And he wouldn't be leaving the Labour Party. The Labour Party has left him. He is wrong because even after Jeremy Corbyn left, there was another leadership contest. Remember, Jeremy Corbyn was only on the ticket in the first place because the centrist Labour MPs made a mistake. They thought it would be good to have a spectrum of views on the ballot paper, and they immediately said they regretted it as soon as it turned out to be a very popular option. Then Clive Lewis stood. I think Clive Lewis is great. He's definitely on the left. I don't think he's like some radical Marxist communist. But he couldn't even make the ballot paper because those Labour MPs were like, "Oh no, we can't have that. That's a bit too left." Since then, we've had another general election, and we have hundreds of very objectively right-wing Labour MPs. There is no way there is going to be a left-wing option on the ballot paper. There is no way the Labour Party machine that has been entirely captured by corporate capital and by Starmerism will be there. And the next future leader will be Yvette Cooper or be Wes Streeting. It could, at a push, be Angela Rayner. But what I would say is, what has Angela Rayner's record been in this government? Do people really believe that she's the future and the hope of the left? I think any of these things are clearly absurd. So to come back to your question, I think the answer is for the Green Party to continue to build its links with the left, not just with the left. And maybe we'll talk in a moment how I think we can speak to disillusioned reform voters. And I think that is important. I think we can speak to people who are in rural communities. They're being screwed over by the same system that mean people can't get council houses. Farmers are being screwed over by aggregate capital and supermarkets that aren't paying them properly. I think also we can inspire people who have never voted before because they think politics doesn't stand for them. This is all where my leadership campaign is heading, is ultimately saying we cannot keep speaking to the same people. We cannot keep hoping that we can go to 4, 5, 6 MPs and just kind of slowly grow. What we need to be is bold in our communications, speak to people who have never been spoken to by a politician before, who have never connected with a politician before, or maybe connected under Jeremy Corbyn or people like Jeremy Corbyn, but have gone, I've lost all hope now. And actually gone, I see that the hope isn't being placed in one person. This isn't about Zack Polanski at the front and only about me. This is about me saying, I want to facilitate all of those grassroots groups, all of those communities that I have met regularly and have met regularly for years. So it's not just like I've sprung up and I'm saying this now. I've been doing the work and going, I've seen the potential and the power to do what I've already been doing, which is lift and amplify other voices. But this is about what happens if we accelerate that, what if we do that on a national stage? Because we can have all the ground game we want. We've got our ground game really good. We just won 4 MPs. But ultimately, knocking on the doors and delivering leaflets can only take you so far. And Reform have demonstrated when you have a bold campaign that speaks clearly about the things you stand for, that cuts through on media. I would never ape Nigel Farage in terms of the things he stands for or the lies he tells. But in the way that he tells a story, I think we need to tell similar stories, but our stories are based in fact. Our stories are based in science. His stories are based in lies and misinformation. He's playing politics on easy mode. We're playing it on difficult mode. We can moan about that or we can just get better. And I plan to be better. I think the trade unions are noticing that. I think that it can only last so long. That there's the biggest gap, isn't there, between the leaders of the trade union movement and the establishment who are clearly clinging on to the status quo, who are clearly clinging on to power and their connections with the Labour cabinet. But then much more widely, you have this huge grassroots movement of members within the trade unions who are saying, because they're actually saying we want bold leadership now. And I think there's only so long that the trade union leaders can cling on to that power before we will see a new generation of trade union leaders who actually go, you know, we can see that our future is aligning with the Green Party, or even if we don't get to that stage straight away, this is already happening, just amplifying Green voices and going, actually, these people are saying the things that we want them to say, and the Labour government aren't, then people will do the math.
So you mentioned about wealth tax, right? But really, the Green Party platform is only a small amount. And look, wealth taxes are good. You know, I support the wealth tax. But the problem I have is the way it's been framed is if we tax wealth at this sort of percent, then we'll bring in X amount of money. But the big issue is that the billionaire class owns everything. So surely a small tax on wealth won't do anything. You know, how is it going to curb corporate power? So, I mean, I understand the argument, which is we need to bring a certain amount of money to pay on public services. But for me, it's about addressing inequality. Surely your policy doesn't go far enough. And then also, would you like to see billionaires abolished?
Yeah. So let's start with that. I don't think there's any reason why there should be a billionaire. I think there are people who are earning more money in their sleep than the vast majority of the country, in fact, indeed the world, could earn, even though they're working with their hands or their brain every single day. That is clearly inequitable, and I think is something that absolutely needs to be challenged. A wealth tax is the first step. So I think that's the first way of, I think it's very effective in highlighting to people the mass inequality. And when people hear just 1% on 1%, and that could raise between 30 and 50 billion pounds, I think the answer is what? And I think we've experienced the what now. And I think what we've moved into is actually, how can we do this now? You know, what are you actually talking about when you talk about wealth in terms of assets? And I see that as a win. I think that's a healthy progression of the conversation. And somewhere actually the Green Party, along with people like Gary Stevenson and Zara Sultana and people who've been calling out for this, are pushing that conversation forwards. I think the next conversation we need to have, and it's a much more complex conversation, and I've definitely been having it, but less front and center, is around asset management. It's around BlackRock. It's around the company that have just bought Thames Water. Thames Water are pumping sewage into our water and asking us to pay extra for the privilege. Our bills are going up. So nationalizing companies that run vital services, water, energy, the railways. Obviously, the Labour government have kind of partially nudged the railways, but they haven't done the rolling stock, which is the really vital part of it. So it's very symbolic. But actually nationalizing our public services would go a long way too. Because actually what we've seen over decades, and this is what austerity has been a cover for, or not even a cover for, a accelerator for, is pushing public money into private capital. And actually what we need to do with public money is spend to invest. And so the way to challenge inequality in this country is to massively invest in our communities. Thatcher said there's no such thing as society. Then Blair continued that. Then we saw it under the Tory government, and it's absolutely still under Keir Starmer, in fact, talking about island of strangers or people as strangers, is echoing all of that language and the natural continuation of it. So not only have they tried to destroy the idea of community, they've destroyed the physical sense of community. Just last week, I was in Totnes, a youth centre that is being closed down, and hearing from young people and local people how much that youth centre means to people. Because what happens when you close a youth centre? The next thing is young people hang out on the street. Then what happens? The police come because of antisocial behaviour. This is criminalising a very specific political project from the powerful and the wealthy, which is to take away community, because there's nothing more powerful when communities get together, when we eat together, when we pray together, or if people aren't religious, just gather together to say there's something wrong and we need to do something different. The establishment class over decades have done everything they can to break that down. Once they broke that down, people are still gathering, but they gather now to protest. So what did they do? They're criminalizing protest. They will keep trying to find ways to mean that people can't meet in real life, people can't organize, because actually that's the most powerful thing we can do. And that is real leadership. And the final thing I'd say on that is when I come to the leadership campaign, one of the things I've heard is that real power is being in Westminster. I could not disagree more. Real power is exactly what I was just talking about. It's the people that I hear from in their communities who are saving their local park, who are getting the community centre reopened, who are protecting their library, who are protecting their friends, who are migrants, who are being deported by the state, but they're going to stand there and put their physical bodies in the line. That's real power. Real power is when a politician can speak up for trans rights. Real power is when someone can say we need rent controls now. Real power is when we say a billionaire should be abolished. There's nothing more powerful than being bold in your communication. Yes, we need more MPs. Yes, we need people holding the Prime Minister to account. But I don't want to keep holding people to account. I want to see a Green government, and that's real power.
So Adrian Ramsey, current co-leader of the Green Party, he's announced he's going to be standing, not with Carla Denyer, because Carla Denyer is going to be stepping down, but with Ellie Chance, and she's the MP for North Herefordshire. What's the difference, the clear difference between your campaign, Zack Polanski for leader, and Adrian and Ellie's pitch?
So I've preempted your question. I think the big difference is they see real power as in Westminster. And I don't have to create an abstract argument for that. The Lib Dems have got 72 MPs. I would love 72 MPs. I'm not knocking that. But what are they changing? What are they doing? Ed Davies still has to do stunts to get a moment of attention. And even when he gets a moment of attention, I genuinely could not tell you the things he stands for other than social care, in which he's done a good job in cutting through on that. But that's like the one thing. And even then, I couldn't tell you what his exact policy is. So we can get big groups of MPs, but unless we have a coherent narrative, unless we're actually built from the grassroots, where we go, we are building real power, we are building real communities to challenge the powerful and the wealthy, and then in order to take power in the future, then I'm not sure. It's not fair to say I'm not sure what that project is. I can see what they're doing, and it's not something I don't support. In fact, I've supported it for the last few years, which is incremental change. You grow and you hope to get more MPs, and that's been working. But what is happening, or what has changed? We've got Nigel Farage, we've got a Reform Party who are rapidly accelerating. We have a nature and climate crisis. We talk a lot about climate, but also we are one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. And this Labour government are destroying nature. They are replacing nature, which in itself is just an absurd kind of idea. But they're not even replacing it in the same community where it's destroyed. Why does that matter? Because it's also an inequality issue. That means you can go to working class communities, to council housing estates, destroy what nature or tree they have, and then replace it in the next borough along or the next county along in a very wealthy area and give them some more nice trees. One, you can't really replace a mature tree. We're not talking about something that's like 20, 30 years. We're talking hundreds of years old. But two, it's a social justice issue. So that's accelerating. We've got to challenge it. We had racist riots on our streets last summer, and it feels like no one talks about that anymore. I was out there with people, in places like Walthamstow, but also Manchester, Sheffield, these amazing like shows of solidarity where people got out and said, these people do not represent us. But racism didn't go away. The rise of the far right didn't go away. It was an amazing show of solidarity. My boyfriend's British Asian. I know what it meant to him and how emotional that was to see people say, we stand with you. But I also know the fear that families like his had when people turn up outside their doors and shout out slurs. That has not gone away. And so getting a few more MPs, that's not going to cut it. We need to take on the far right. And then the deepening inequality, which we've spoken about a lot in this interview, but that's not going away either. So I don't think it's okay to challenge a prime minister who is implementing a neoliberal project that is moving us to the far right, that is echoing the language of the far right. I think the only response to that is to get out to the grassroots, to go to the communities, say we deserve better, we need to grow here, and actually we can grow with the Green Party. And I think to demonstrate that, I don't have the exact numbers because it's just rumors, but I've heard a huge chunk of people joined the day I announced my leadership bid. And I think that's because people have been waiting for this moment. And I really don't think they've been waiting for me. I don't think it's about like a personality thing. I think it's about waiting for someone to step up and state the bloody obvious
Mm.
that the country is in dire a state and status quo, sensible politics. I'm not classing them as that. That's unfair, but I'm talking about more widely the kind of politics we see day in, day out is not going to cut it. It's not working.
It's would you describe it as briefcase politics? Because it made me laugh. There was an article in, in Open Democracy, and you were quoted saying, "Now is not the time for briefcase politics." What is briefcase politics in your words?
Well, this is where you should cut into Helena No Justice NTG because I've stolen it direct from Helena, and I think you
She
should
noticed that as well.
always credit your source. But when she said it, I was just like, that's it. And I think a phrase is powerful when you hear it, and I will explain it. But I think sometimes when you hear it and you instinctively know what they're saying, that's a powerful phrase. And briefcase politics, I guess at its worst, is Rachel Reeves on budget day when she's walking around with her kind of red case and displaying it for the world. Obviously, it's not just Rachel Reeves; it's been every chancellor, the last few chancellors where we've had, where it just feels like they're very pleased with themselves. But what they're implementing is the continuation of the status quo. Sometimes they're making the status quo worse, and they're going to speak in sound bites, phrases that don't really mean anything, that are completely superfluous and aren't really going to change the material living conditions of people in this country, particularly the working class. And I think briefcase politics is being okay with turning up for work every day, logging in, uh, doing a shift, maybe filming a video for TikTok that doesn't really grab anyone, um, in the evening, doing a sensible kind of politics show, and then going to bed and just feeling like you're changing the world. Actually, what I think is we need a radical politics, which is involves picket lines, it involves activism, it involves being in those media spaces. And I really liked what a Guardian journalist, Zoe Williams, wrote in a piece about me this week, where she said, God forgive if a politician becomes difficult and or popular, and what happens when they're both, i.e. Jeremy Corbyn, both difficult and popular. And I think we need politicians that are willing to be difficult, that when you go into a media space, you say the thing that you're not allowed to say, or you change the conversation. I guess the most obvious is when people talk to me, it happens constantly about what we're going to do about the migrant crisis. And when you challenge the frame even of a migrant crisis, you see brains explode from journalists who go, you can't do that because we're not having the conversation now that we're meant to be having. I think we need to do that more effectively. But I just use it as an example of being difficult. And what I see in politicians sometimes, uh, and can sometimes come from Green MPs, is an unwillingness to be difficult in terms of wanting to be polite, acceptable, appropriate. I think politeness is important. I think acceptableness to a point is important. I think appropriateness to a point is important. But I also think you've got to pick moments where actually you say,
I mean, we're in
screw
an
polite.
era of populism, and I think that's one of the criticisms, and I've got that same criticism of the Green Party, which is maybe too nice, maybe it's briefcase politics, but you're facing Nigel Farage, who is really popular at the moment. I mean, the local elections shows that you've got polls showing they're 10% clear of the current government, and that niceness isn't cutting through.
Because I think I disagree actually. But I think what you're saying, and I think we entirely agree on, is that we need people who can connect with anger, harness that anger, and be really clear and passionate about the things that need to change. I think you can do that and be nice because actually, I think I'm pretty nice. I'm pretty kind. And I think I would like to think that anyone in the Green Party or anyone on the left is nice and kind because actually, if left wing politics is anything at its heart, it's about kindness, it's about solidarity, it's about compassion. I think if you come there first, though, and you miss where people are, then you just look totally disconnected and you look like you're living a very comfortable middle class life or a very status quo life. So I get where the criticism is coming from. And I think there's absolutely legitimacy in the premise. But the way it's often phrased, this idea that we need angrier politicians, I just think if we all turn angry, what we've actually done is let the far right win, because in anger, you lose compassion, you lose solidarity, because it just gets about
But a lot of
attacking.
people are angry, and sometimes they want to see a politician that's angry for them. And when you see politicians saying, "Oh, I'm really angry," but they visibly don't look angry, that is part of the disconnect. So I suppose, I mean, to reframe my question, it's not about being horrible and not nice, but it's showing that actually you feel that anger, and maybe sometimes expressing that anger could be a useful tool and what people are looking for.
I'm so pissed off, and I think it's being able to express that in a way which is. So I'll give you an example. I was in LBC with the deputy editor of the Telegraph, political editor, Annabel Benham, and called her out because she said the Palestinian marches were hate marches. She said, I'll get accused of, I didn't even call her a racist, which by the way, I think she's a racist, but I didn't even do that on LBC. She said, I'll get, you'll say that this is racist. I said, it's a racist thing to say. There is a difference between calling someone a racist, which I knew was going to get me chucked off the show, and saying that's a racist thing to say. And I thought that's the better thing to do in this moment, to use the platform to keep having the conversation. And she said, next you'll call me a bigot. And I said, I will if you say bigoted things. And I was asked to apologize by the host, who was more offended by me calling out the racism than the racism itself. Then tweeted later on to say that he's never been so close to kicking someone off the show. And I think that talks to the tightrope when you're dealing with the legacy media. So yes, you need to be angry, and yes, you need to be passionate. But actually, if you just go on there and rage, you're never going to come back. And you're never going to get to say the things you need to say. Now, I think there's a legitimate argument to say, don't come back then, screw them. But I also think there's a moment of pragmatism, and I'm always cautious with the word pragmatism because it often gets used to say, do the things that I want you to do and don't actually challenge power. But I think there's a pragmatism to use the mechanisms of state, or the mechanisms of the media, to go, there is a place that we can be where we are massively pushing. And I do believe I do that without stepping over the line where you then lose all access to it. And I think that is never something that is locked in. I think it's a moment to moment kind of judgment call. And I think we need to elect the people that we trust to make those decisions.
So I think it's quite widely known that the Green Party have a very unique coalition. You've got the young urban progressives who live in cities, and those in rural areas, dare I say, people might say middle class. Adrian won his seat from the Conservatives at the last election. I don't think it's wrong to say that you probably fit more in the former camp, but how can you unite the party and bring everyone into your agenda?
Yeah, so the first thing to say is we were second place in 39 seats. Every single one of those 39 seats was in second place to an unpopular Labour government who will be increasingly unpopular at the next general election. So I think the first place in this conversation is, what does it look like in those 39 seats to challenge the Labour Party with good, strong, diverse working class candidates who have experience of life, who can speak powerfully against the Labour MP who has supported this government for the last 4 years. I think that by then it'll be the last 4 years or 3 years, whenever the election is, or 5 years. So I think that's the first place to start. But it is also true that we won seats in rural areas from fourth place and we jumped to first place. So it's not that you just need to be second place. I think anyone on the left, and indeed anyone, even if they live in London as I do, or Manchester, or Birmingham, or Wales, also needs to recognize that the way to stop reform is to be powerful in those rural seats too. So I don't believe that we can have a party that is just urban and just about cities. And also, inequality hurts you everywhere, whether you live deep in the city or whether you live and you're a farmer. You are getting screwed over by the same 1%, the same multimillionaires and billionaires, whether that's through agriculture, the corporate nature of that now, or supermarkets not paying you properly. I think this message of tackling inequality and a good, strong local person who will speak out for you in government that is based in the grassroots is a powerful story wherever you live. And so I think the Green Party actually has a unique moment where we are able to speak to both of those coalitions, or the more spectrum of coalitions. Now, that sometimes gets accusatory and people go, you're saying different things to different people. I'm absolutely not. And what I love about this is, I've always said this, but during the election, Helena Horton, who's a Guardian journalist, she followed me for 4 or 5 hours around Wiltshire, um, a place that's pretty, Tory in the past. And we must have knocked on loads of doors together. We did not find a single Labour or Conservative voter. What we found in all of those hours were people saying, I'm either going to vote for a Reform Party or I'm going to vote for the Green Party. Now, on some of those doorsteps, people were just explicitly racist. I wasn't going to win their vote, nor would I seek to. But on, I would say, the majority of those doorsteps, once we got into a conversation that was a little bit deeper, they were worried about housing. They were worried about the cost of living. They were worried about big corporate capital. There were things we could absolutely connect on. In fact, a poll just out this week showed that Reform voters are one of the highest groups of people who most want to see taxes on oil and gas companies, which is an interesting position for Nigel Farage to negotiate when he's taking that same money from those same donors. So I do think there's a huge moment, both in rural areas and urban areas, to put forward the green agenda. And this is where it comes back to eco-populism. I don't think we're going to win all of those voters by being earnest about climate change or the climate crisis. The climate crisis absolutely exists and we should talk about it, but we shouldn't come through the lens of talking about the climate crisis. We'll just miss people. What you need to come through the lens of is what is happening right now in this country in inequality, and how the climate crisis through wildfires and floods is going to exacerbate that inequality. And that affects no one more than farmers. Because just a couple of weeks ago, I was in Runcorn. I met a dairy farmer who was essentially being priced out of his entire intergenerational business because of land contamination. This gets quite technical, but ultimately in the 60s and 70s, huge corporates dumping waste onto his land because it was convenient. That land that has infected the soil and the rivers. There's lots of research to show, there's cows that are deformed. There was a baby in the area that was born blind. Like that contaminated land is having serious effects on the livestock or the animals and on the food that he's seeking to grow. Now, I'm vegan. There's not a lot I have in common with a dairy farmer at first sight. But actually, when you have a conversation on a human nature and you recognize that people and farmers in particular are going to be a huge part of the just transition, i.e., making sure that we have food resilience, that we're protecting farmers and we're protecting their livelihoods as they are met by the same challenges we all met, then you realize actually the best thing we could be doing right now on the left is reaching out to farmers and saying, we are not enemies. We are friends in this fight against the climate crisis.
So economic class issues, these ideas from the left are popular and unifying. But when we get onto culture and social issues, this is where the left is attacked. And I'm sure you've had people call on you to maybe water down more divisive issues. Yet many people, especially those minority groups, are very anxious. We've got growing anti-immigrant rhetoric, not just from reform. And we've got Keir Starmer, we're going to touch on a speech in a second. We've also got the recent Supreme Court ruling on trans people. Are you making a commitment to stand with minority groups whilst also selling the left populist message? And can you do that?
Absolutely. And this is without question of all the things you've asked me. This is the thing I'm most committed to. I think there's a increasing narrative, and particularly in the left, to be honest, that we cannot win on social issues. So we just need to focus on economic issues. I think as soon as we do that, I mean, why are we focusing on economic issues? First of all, we're focusing on economic issues because we want to tackle inequality and we want to make sure that the most marginalized groups in society aren't having an awful time. And an awful time is a pretty understatement. Trans people, I think many of them feel from speaking to them right now that they are fighting for their lives in terms of if you don't feel like you can even use a toilet anymore without being attacked, then how do you expect to exist in society? I think it is as existential as that. Now, I'm careful with my language because I know some trans people who go, I'm okay actually, and what I don't want my fear to be overinflated, and I don't want to be a part of the culture war. And so, although I'm answering the question you've asked me because you're asking me a question, I'm not going to dodge it. I think the most important thing is that we have trans people speaking about these issues, and actually we platform their voices because that's most important that we hear from them. I think though, so to come back, we're trying to tackle inequality. If we throw marginalized groups under the bus in order to tackle inequality, that's completely incoherent. The thing we absolutely want to do is to protect marginalized groups and to protect the oppressed. We don't do it by screwing them over. What we do is by being unequivocal in about saying they are not your enemy. They are not the problem here. The problem here is the super wealthy, the multimillionaires and billionaires, and being absolutely crystal clear on that. Do I think there are arguments to be sidestepped that I think are unhelpful? Yes, I think that there are sometimes the media kind of like throw us into culture wars because they want to distract from the economic conversation and the inequality conversation. I think we need skilled politicians, and I hope I'm working on this. And when I say skilled politician, I don't mean in the traditional sense of a politician that dodges questions, but actually someone who can answer a question clearly and shut it down quite quickly and go, next subject, let's talk about the multimillionaires and billionaires who are screwing us over. And I think that's something I'm always working on and I think we need to do. And when we talk about migrants, it's exactly the same thing. We don't win the conversation about migration by giving an inch to the right. And Keir Starmer, if you're being generous, has given an inch to the right. I'd say he's given a lot more than an inch.
I mean, his speech quite literally quoted Enoch Powell.
Yeah.
I really want to get your response on that. And I also want to add, do you think that Keir Starmer is the worst Labour leader ever?
I'll come back to that in a second because my brain needs to process other awful Labour leaders. But the Enoch Powell statement, disgusting, vile, despicable. I don't, think it can be condemned in enough words. And we talk about anger. This was a moment I was on a radio show the other night where I just sat down in the seat and just felt the anger seize. I actually thought there's nothing here that there doesn't need to be a barrier here. actually what migrant and communities and frankly people of color need to hear right now is someone speaking who is going to call out the racism and actually the fascism. And I don't think, that's not a word that should just be bandied about. But actually, if you've reached the point where you are saying people in communities are strangers to this country, you have taken seemingly false patriotism to the fascism end. Like that is a road to nowhere. That is a spiraling down of what's going to happen next, and that is worrying. I think it's worrying for those communities, but it should worry anyone who cares about decency and about humanity in this country. And the idea of you sometimes hear the language of legitimate concerns. And I think this is nuanced language because I think there's ways it's used that are absolutely vile that I will call out in a moment. And there's ways it's used that we should talk about. The way it's used as vile is when you say legitimate concerns because in some ways migrants are a threat or any more of a threat than someone who has lived in Britain all their life is nonsense. And we know that from objective evidence. We also know from objective evidence that a migrant is much more likely to pay more in tax to the system than is to claim in benefits. We know from objective evidence that if you use the National Health Service, the person who treats or cares for you is so much more likely to be a migrant than anyone in front of you in the queue. Now, I can talk about all of those facts and evidence till I'm blue in the face, or green in the face, I suppose. That's not going to change anything. And we've been doing that for years. What we need is powerful stories to counter the stories that Farage is telling. Where I do think there are legitimate concerns are not legitimate concerns about migrants, the legitimate concerns about austerity, for the fact that people can't get a home, that they can't get an NHS appointment, the things we've been talking about. Those are legitimate concerns that are not solved by throwing migrants under the bus. They're solved by absolute solidarity and speaking boldly on behalf of migrants or ideally with migrants and amplifying their voice and calling out the austerity and saying the answer here is to tax the multimillionaires and billionaires, to bring in the land value tax, to bring corporation tax in line with income tax, all the things we've been talking about. Those are the answers here. You do not do that by throwing social issues under the bus. You only do that actually by being really clear about why you're standing for those people, why you're standing with those people, and your solidarity will never waver.
Can I get an answer on Keir Starmer?
Yeah. I mean, it's between him and Blair, right? And I suppose Blair can point at Sure Start centres. Blair can point at, can't reel off Labour achievements. I'm sure there'll be someone in the comments who immediately goes, here's all the Blair's achievements. But, I think sometimes if you've got achievements and they are used to mask going into an illegal war and knowing it, or knowing that you're Thatcher's legacy, or indeed piping up at the moment to say, let's not tackle the climate crisis too fast. I'm going to say Blair's worse than Starmer because I think he's enabled Starmer. I think we would have never got Starmer without Blair. Don't take that as an endorsement for Starmer. Don't be clipping me, people.
Last time we spoke face to face, maybe 2 years ago, we spoke about how I think we both agreed that Keir Starmer was probably to the right of David Cameron, right?
Yes.
I think since then there's been even more of a travel to the right from Keir Starmer. Are you actually shocked by how right wing he's become?
He's to the right of Nigel Farage at this point, and I don't think that's deniable. Like, we've seen Farage turn up at steel plants and say nationalise the steel plants while Starmer's been completely absent from the conversation. They then talk about nationalisation, but it's in a very kind of, we regret this, we might have to do it temporarily, but as soon as we can find, some rich dude to give us the money, then we'll be on our knees and begging for it. And so on nationalisation to the right, to be quoting Enoch Powell, again, don't take this as an endorsement for Nigel Farage, but I don't think he'd be so brazen to do that. I think, he'd be worried about respectability. I think there's some of the other Reform MPs who'd probably go there, but Farage would go, that's a bit fascistic even for me. So, I think the fact that the Starmer's in that space is pretty grim. And then I think the gaslighting on Gaza. Yeah. And again, we've seen that they are worse than the Tories have been in terms of the arms that they've supplied to Gaza to make sad faces about the destruction and the genocide of Palestinians, but then at the same time to be enabling it to happen is the ultimate moral litmus test of our times. And I don't think Starmer should ever be forgiven for that. When Starmer's gone, you will get centrist politicians who supported him now who go, he wasn't that bad. He did these things and announced his set of things.
Historical revisionism on Keir Starmer.
Exactly. And I think the story needs to be told right now, not until after he's gone, that this is the Prime Minister that watched this happen, didn't watch this happen, that helped enable this happen and stood by why it happened. Whilst at the same time being solid on Ukraine, for instance. We should absolutely stand with Ukrainians. People have a sovereign right to have their own independence. And that's why I say that for the Palestinians. And the only moral clarity and the only consistent answer is also to say that for the Ukrainians too. The fact that Starmer can do it for one group but not the other shows how his moral clarity is absolutely picked and chosen for by who's paying him and who he chooses to support. And that's despicable.
Let's talk about reform. Okay, you touched upon it. I really want to get into this. I said before, some polls, reform are beating the current government by 10%, and it's not even been a year for the Labour Party. They had an extremely good showing at the local elections. Why are they surging so quickly? Why do you think that people are finding reform appealing? And I think young men as well are finding them appealing. What do they speak to that maybe the progressives and the lefts hasn't done beforehand?
Yeah. So I think the case study for this is Bernie Sanders, actually. Millions of people supporting him. He drops out of the race or gets beaten by Hillary Clinton. Those people go support Trump. Not all of them, but a huge amount of them. There's lots of evidence for that. Do I think people went from a left wing candidate to someone on the right or the far right? No, I don't. What I do think, though, is lots of people want to see the rules change, or not even the rules change. They want to see people actually stick by the rules, as opposed to this kind of artifice of rules that we have in our politics the entire time. The things you can say, the things you can't say, the things you can do, the things you can't do. Farage is a master at being a disruptor, getting into the system, and seemingly speaking from the heart about the things he cares about. Now, I think that's an artifice, and I think it's an illusion in the same way that it is with Donald Trump. I do think there's a weird kind of perverted honesty in that they are saying what is on their mind in that moment. And I think that's refreshing for people. I think what people are rejecting is the absolute equivocation of a politician being asked a question, the kind of long pause, the sound bites, and then the refusal to give an answer. I think there's a risk to the way that I like to do politics, and I think lots of people on the left do politics, which is to answer the question, to sometimes say something and hear it come out of my mouth and be surprised at the thing I've said and go, "Oh, I've not heard myself phrase it that way before." I think there's a bravery to that and a risk to that. And it means sometimes you'll say something you regret, but I also think I believe I have the agility once I've heard it to a moment later. In fact, I've done it in this interview to go, "Oh, that wasn't quite the right word, or that wasn't the right sentence." So I think there's a refreshingness to that. And I don't mean just me on that. I think there's lots of people on the left who have that. But I think it's also undeniable there's lots of people on the right who have that. And the reason why they have it on the right is because they don't need to worry about information. They don't need to worry about science. They don't need to worry about facts. They can just speak freely. On the left, we just need to get better at it, really, really knowing the information, really, really knowing the facts. So it's absolutely at our fingertips at any moment, but also we're just able to speak freely. And the way we can do that is by only having two vested interests, and that's people and that's the planet. And when you're coming from a place where you're not lying, when you're not covering anything up, when you're not having to protect anything other than those two things, I think that's when you can speak freely. I think what the left needs to do is speak more freely. And then the second bit, I would say actually, I keep talking about her in interviews, fanboying, but Ash Sarkar, I think what she does amazing is she speaks freely, but I think the thing she adds is humor as well. It really undercuts things. Um, and as I think I'm a little bit funny, but I'm not the wit that is Ash Sarkar. But I think more generally, and this isn't a one man operation, just on the left more generally, I think being willing to know that things are super serious and this is not a game, but also seeing the silliness in the way the game is played. So being absolutely serious about the consequences of things, and this is for people's lives, but also not being so earnest and so po-faced the entire time, but actually being willing to call out the nonsense. Call out the nonsense, I guess is the phrase. But with wit is one of the most powerful things you can do.
NATO. Now, I was quite surprised at this announcement from you. It kind of seemed like it came out of nowhere, right? You said the UK, and obviously I'll allow you to elaborate, but you said the UK should leave NATO. And the big reason is because we can't trust Donald Trump. I think that's a given. Can you talk me through this and why you've come out with it now? And are you worried this actually could be quite divisive, not just with the country, but possibly with Green Party members? Why did you feel like it was important to make that intervention now?
So I was quite surprised too when I'd say the article is misleading. Um, if you read the article, the facts and the nuance are in there, but the headline and the picture are entirely misleading. So let me tell you what happened. Journalist from Byline Times did a long conversation with me about my leadership bid. I talked about lots of the things I'm talking about now. Towards the very end of the conversation, he said, "What Green Party policy do you want to change?" And I answered, as any Green Party leader should do, that it's not for the leadership to change policy. In the Green Party, it's membership who decide policy. It's one member, one vote. That's decided at conference. And he said, if you could change something or something needs to change in the long term, what is it? And I said, and I believe, that I think the age of NATO is over. Now, why do I believe that? Trump is threatening to annex Greenland. Now, people who really support NATO, who really are shouting at me about national security, have one of two decisions to make. They either believe Trump, and so he's going to invade Greenland, who is a NATO ally partner. Article 5 triggers, which means we are in World War III. We are at war with America when we join with Greenland. That clearly is not a scenario that I think anyone wants or can happen. So that first scenario, I already go, NATO isn't working. We need to look at the alternative, and I'll talk about the alternative in a second. The second thing, which I think is probably more probable, is they think Trump is bluffing and he's never going to annex Greenland. He's just talking about it. Trump is a fascist dictator. He's someone who has nuclear weapons. He has someone who I think the stat is selling 60% or 70% of the weapons that happen in NATO are from Trump. So there's mass domination and power from America, who now have Trump at the top of it, who is just, even if he's not going to annex Greenland, is talking about it. Is that someone we want to be in alliance with? Is that a way of keeping global security, to be with someone that we think is lying to us for his own gain and ramping up global insecurity because he wants to make money from it, or he wants to swing his weight around? That is also clearly not okay. So the age of NATO is over, and it's the and that's really important here. We need to look at alternative alliances. And actually, I don't think our alliances are anymore with America. And by the way, people immediately shout Putin at me at this point, leaving NATO. Trump says he admires Putin. Trump is in an alliance pretty much at this point with Putin. We saw Trump absolutely destroy or try to destroy Zelensky in the White House in a pretty awful display of bullying and inequality as someone who is fighting a war for his country. And so anyone who is coming from a sensible, moderate position who says that the situation right now is okay clearly doesn't care about global security and is clearly at this point aligning with an American president who is aligning himself with another dictator in Russia who is a clear threat to our country in terms of cybersecurity, if nothing else. So then, what is the alternative? The alternative, I think, is not a military alliance. I think it's a peace alliance. It's talking about diplomacy. And who do I think the first people to talk to about that? It's the European Union. The European Union, at its heart, was a peace project. It was about building diplomacy. It was about saying books, not bombs. It was about looking at how can we build these alliances so that we don't face these situations in the future. We don't seem to be in those conversations. Keir Starmer seems to be showing no interest in rejoining the European Union or even having a close relationship with European partners, which is based on diplomacy and not on war. So when I say we need to leave NATO, the important second part of that conversation is once we have built an alternative alliance that is based on diplomacy and democracy rather than war. I don't think that's a contentious position. I think the contentious position at this point is that things are okay and that we're fine having a special relationship with someone who is fine having a special relationship with Putin. That's a dire place to be in. I'm not pretending that I have an easy solution to geopolitics and to global insecurity. But what I am saying very clearly is the solution that centrists and people on the right and the Labour Party pretend they have, you only have to think about for 30 seconds to know is going to come crashing down, is coming crashing down, and no one seems to have an alternative. So we can either avoid that conversation and, worry about it when it happens. I don't think that's a plan. Or we can go, what does it look to have conversations right now? And by the way, not just with the European Union, what does it look like if you get Putin, Netanyahu, and like everyone round the table and go, what happens if we have the world leaders talking, but about diplomacy and not about weapons? People will say that's naive, but Nelson Mandela did it with the ANC. We did it during the Troubles when it looked like a resolution was never going to be met. When you disagree with people, you don't then arm yourself even more and then bomb the crap out of them. I mean, we do. That's not what we should do. But what you can do and should do, and global leadership looks like, is bringing people around the table and saying, let's talk first of all.
The reason why Turn Left exists is because our media is completely and utterly appalling. British media is terrible. The media don't platform the Greens nowhere near as much as Nigel Farage historically. That's happened for decades. We know that. But what is your media strategy? You've spoken about how you would navigate the corporate media, but what's your plan on forcing the mainstream media to talk about you? Because I know one excuse is, yes, they're not going to platform the Greens. That's okay, fine, but that's not that's not a strategy. So what can you do as Green Party leader, if you were to become a leader, to grab those headlines?
Since I announced my leadership bid, if I just look at yesterday, I did 2 national interviews. I recorded a podcast. I went on BBC London and spoke to a national newspaper in Scotland as well. The reason why I'm listing all of those things is that's been a very typical day for the last 10 days. And the reason why I think the media are showing interest is one, it's a leadership contest. Yes, fair enough. That's a bit more interesting than business as usual. But second, because I presented a clear platform and I'm saying this is where I want the Green Party to be, I think that's interesting for the media. So the first answer to your question is we need to be more interesting. We very often focus on policy and detail and evidence. Those things are really important. I'm not saying those things should go away, but those aren't what you lead on. You lead on the things that's going to grab people's attention. Now, you've got to be careful with that. That comes to the last conversation we were just having. Once I gave that nuanced and complex answer, the next thing I saw was a picture of me with a megaphone looking like a wild activist. It is a picture of me. I am a wild activist. But I think, what was missing from there was the fact that I've been in an elected office for 4 years. I've chaired the Environment Committee of London for the last 3 years. I now chair the Fire Committee. Those are, I would like to think, responsible jobs that require elected office that is in a way that you can conduct yourself in those environments where you're not being chucked out and you're not gluing yourselves to tables. As much as that's a legitimate protest tactic, I also believe in the legitimacy of democracy and the legitimacy of being elected politician. So you've got to find the balance between that. The second thing I think is not to rely on legacy media. Support independent media. They don't receive donations from multimillionaires or billionaires. You're funded by people who watch videos like this, who give small amounts. And I joke about that, but actually that's really important that politicians with a platform do what they can to also support independent media, because I think um, it's absolutely your right, and it's the right of every independent media organization to scrutinize me, and I know that will continue to happen. But also, I think there's a two-way thing there too, which is not just to be scrutinized, but actually go, I think these guys are doing a really good job. I think these guys are platforming stories that don't get platformed on mainstream media. So actually, the best thing I can do is turn up whenever I'm asked and be willing to have a conversation and be scrutinized. And then other thing, and I think this is vital, is not to rely on media. Social media is where it's at now. When I launched, my launch video has been seen 1.4 million times. I'm not complacent. Seeing videos on social media and people voting in leadership contests are two different things. By the way, insert here that anyone who joins the Green Party, no hint here, by July 31st can vote in this leadership election. It's one member, one vote. So actually, if people agree with the things I'm saying and they want to see a bolder leadership and a bolder Green Party that they feel part of, then it's time to join the Green Party. But when I talk about grassroots organizing and community organizing, that is also a moment to say, what does it look like when those same grassroots and those same communities do social media properly? What does it look like when we train and invest in people so they're able to tell videos about what's happening in their community? I think that's much more interesting than the topic of the day, or something that Rachel Reeves has said, that, every legacy media organization will be having the same conversation on repeat that you can listen to double time in your ear, because you're just like, I already know what everyone's going to say. So I'm just listening to see if someone says something interesting, and they don't. What are those interesting stories that actually happen in communities that independent media and social media can platform to go, Westminster are having one conversation, but the real conversation that's happening in this country right now is here. And how can we tell powerful stories doing that? That's not easy to do because, I've encouraged people to do videos before, and then bless them, there's a wobbly camera with bad quality video. Yeah, I've been accused of this before too. Like, it's not, I'm a full-time politician. Like, I'm in committees, I'm voting, I'm doing media interviews. When I met Gary Stevenson, he was talking to me about the importance of the regularness of the algorithm. I think it was even someone who said you need to do like TikTok 3 times a day. I'm like, I don't have time to do TikTok 3 times a day. But I think there's a balance between being like an influencer and someone who is amazing on Instagram or TikTok or any of these channels, and just doing some decent content where I've certainly upgraded in my equipment and upgraded kind of in how I think about these storytelling. I'm not going to perfect. I'll continue to do that. But I think all of us need to like raise our game on social media.
Zach, always a pleasure.
Thanks so much for having me.
Good luck on the campaign.
Thank you.